All right, welcome everybody. It's time for our long-awaited review and analysis of the last debate that I engaged in with a Islamic interlocutor, and that was Daniel Haqiqatjou, and that was a few months ago, but we couldn't really organize the time frame until it was right, and we're doing that now. So I have with me Kai and Lewis, of course, our old BFFs, and we're going to be diving into their analysis of the debate, how it went, the strong points, weak points, where arguments were and weren't addressed. And we've got some different presentation slides we're going to be looking at here in a minute. But before we get to the meat of it, let's just do an overall just kind of assessment from both of you guys. What overall did you think of the debate? How did it go? What's your analysis? Can you guys hear me? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Can you hear me, Jay?
Yeah, what's your analysis overall of the debate?
Well, I
Just so
was
overall broad thoughts right here.
okay. So the overall impression was that it went just the way I expected it would go. I think that Daniel just really kind of failed to appreciate what the debate was about. I think he failed to understand your arguments. I think he failed to make a case or to even understand how fallacious his arguments were. Um, Honestly, it was just basically to showcase that the debate showcased that Muslims are just not yet at the level ready to intellectually engage Orthodox Christianity. They don't understand how epistemology works. They're just basically trying to confuse the audience with the nonsense arguments and make it sound as if it's something intellectual when it's really just laughable.
Lewis, what's your general overall thoughts and analysis of the debate?
I pretty much agree with Kai. I think that it went exactly how I expected it would go, almost scriptedly. Um, I think he sort of concedes the debate about halfway through during cross-examination. And yeah, I just think there's some serious limitations on his end with respect to knowledge of the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think that's been a big stumbling block for him. So yeah, that I guess that would be my view.
All right, and so I think both Lewis and Kai have some analyses and points they want to present. I don't know which guy who wants to go. Kai, did you want to go first and make some of your points about Daniel's argumentation?
Yeah, I'll start it off, and then Lewis, I guess you can just play off of some of the stuff that I say here. I'm gonna just take a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes or so, just to kind of encapsulate the way that I see the issue just from an epistemological perspective and why I think that Daniel really kind of failed to make a convincing argument and just to kind of let the audience better appreciate why we stress epistemology and why it's so critical to understanding this debate. So I'll begin by saying, for example, that Daniel's position rests on the claim that since, according to him, Islam has demonstrated capability to preserve the textual integrity of the Quran as well as the traditions necessary to explicate it, for example, hadiths, then the Muslim community is in a privileged position compared to other religious traditions to speak on the truthfulness of God's revelatory history to mankind, namely that Islam can define what and who is a prophet, and therefore can be used as the standard to gauge prophetic claims, past and present. Now, he denies that he's making the argument that preservation equals truth. But in reality, this is exactly the entailment of his position. He's forced to argue that preservation equals truth, even though he denies it, because his position necessitates rejection of all prior history, not just rejecting history that disagrees with the Quran. From an epistemological point of view, that's what you have to understand, which he doesn't. From an epistemological point of view, he has to reject all of history on principle. What the Quran does is inform Muslims of prior history and any so-called knowledge of history that we have by other means that happens to agree with the Quran is taken as truth, but it doesn't increase knowledge. And any so-called knowledge that does not outright contradict the Quran is then taken as probabilistic in its truthfulness until further revelation clarifies. And in my opinion, I think this is an important point, because on principle, epistemologically, the Quran cannot grant justified true belief independent of the Quran, because the manner in which such knowledge is obtained will inevitably contradict the Quran. So the position of Daniel is fundamentally not that the Quran accepts or rejects what agrees or disagrees with it. That certainly is entailed, but fundamentally Daniel's position is to use the Quran to set forth what we can know to be true and false. So the status of the Quran is one of epistemology, namely how we can arrive at justified true belief. And given that preservation of the textual integrity of the Quran is necessitated according to Daniel, then we can be certain that the knowledge it conveys is true. And that's the key point, certainty of true knowledge. So Daniel's position is actually twofold. One, the Quran is the epistemic source that provides true knowledge or justified true belief. And two, preservation of its textual integrity grants certainty of that true knowledge or justified true belief. Basically, if you can't be certain that the Quran is preserved, then you can't be certain if what is conveyed is justified true belief. By taking the position that the Quran is your epistemic source of knowledge, the argument really does boil down to preservation equal to truth. And we all laugh at that, and rightly so. And we pointed this out after the debate, because we don't take the Quran as an epistemic source for justified true belief. So arguments based on its alleged textual preservation does not guarantee us knowledge. We reject the claim that the Quran is an epistemic source. And by doing so, we don't care how the Quran understands what and who is a prophet. And we don't care if prior history agrees or disagrees with the Quran. The argument that Daniel has to make, and one he failed at doing so during the debate, is to establish why we should take the Quran as an epistemic source. In other words, he has to prove that Muhammad was a prophet. He can't just assert it. There is no preservation argument relevant for Christians and Jews living at the time of Muhammad. He can't go to Christians and Jews and say the Quran is preserved. There is no relevance to invoking preservation at the time of Muhammad's supposed revelation, because the argument prior to preservation has to be one of establishing why Christians and Jews living at the time of Muhammad should take his supposed revelations as a source of justified true belief. If you're claiming to be in continuity with prior revelation given to Christians and Jews, then you have to prove Muhammad is a prophet by those prior standards. This is why you have in the Quran verses like Surah 7, verse 157, claiming that Muhammad is to be found in the Torah and the Gospel. And also why the Quran tells Muhammad in Surah 10, verse 94, to go verify the revelations he's receiving with those who have already been reading from the prior scriptures. You cannot divorce proof of Muhammad from prior prophetic tradition, or ignore it when it all of a sudden becomes inconvenient and refutes your claim. The Muslim position by necessity has to start with proving Muhammad is a prophet according to the standards of prior revelatory tradition. You can't take shortcuts to say things like, we don't trust prior sources. We're going to just assert the claim that the Quran is divine revelation, and we're going to set our own standards. That's not even what the Quran itself does. The Quran is clear time and time again that Muhammad sees himself within the existing prophetic tradition and references himself to be found in that tradition. So the prior tradition is the starting point to evaluate the truthfulness of Muhammad's prophetic claim. If you as a Muslim want to dismantle the reliability of that prior tradition, then you're dismantling your own epistemic starting point and simply asserting a new one without proof or justification. But either way, you have to prove Muhammad was a prophet. If you don't want to prove him a prophet according to the prior tradition, which is obvious that you can't, you still have to prove the prophetic status by some means, at which point you've conceded the debate. We are completely epistemically justified to reject the claims of Muhammad's prophetic status absent of proof in line with prior prophetic tradition. And this is how the prophetic claim falls apart. For those Christians and Jews alive at the time of Muhammad, there's no invoking preservation. So we know preservation fundamentally has nothing to do with the primary argument. It's a smokescreen. You can't prove Muhammad a prophet using the existing prophetic tradition. So how else is Muhammad going to prove he is a prophet to Christians and Jews laughing at him? That question by necessity comes prior to setting the Quran as an epistemic source. So if you can't establish that Muhammad was a prophet independent of the Quran itself, according to the existing prophetic tradition, you can't rely on the Quran to inform us what and who is a prophet. Now, think of the example of biblical prophets. They established themselves as prophets according to the existing prophetic tradition as set out in the Torah. It is then that their prophetic speech is recorded in the various books of the Bible, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. So when Muhammad acts outside of the prophetic framework, he is rightly recognized as a false prophet before he even needs to utter a single word of the Quran. As was made clear in the debate, Daniel does not understand even basic epistemology. He doesn't understand how absurdly stupid his circular logic is. And not just Daniel, there is a pervasive and prevalent lack of understanding principles of epistemology generally within the Islamic Ummah. And I don't think Daniel and a lot of Muslims, for that matter, understand what the debate was even about and what Daniel needed to do in order to prove his position. But aside from all of that, Daniel actually can't even make a preservation argument, however he wants to frame it, because he cannot prove that the Quran has been textually preserved, as I'll demonstrate. Nor can he conclusively say what even comprises the Quran, given that within the Islamic tradition itself, there is no consensus what exactly constitutes the Quran, as I'll also demonstrate. So basically, in the debate, Daniel failed to make a proper epistemological case, and the preservation argument, however he wants to frame it, fails because he can't prove that the Quran has been preserved, let alone tell us what exactly comprises the Quran. So I'm just going to end it on that. If Lewis, you want to pick up from there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Kai. Really good.
Can I make one comment before
Yeah,
Lewis goes? Do you want to do your slides at this point or here in a little bit?
If you'd like to make a comment first, that's
Yeah.
fine. I'd like to do my slides though.
Okay, yeah. The only thing I would say there is that I like this basic summation of the issue in terms of epistemology, because a pattern I noticed not just with this debate, but with many debates that I've had, even with Roman Catholics and with atheists like Stefan Molyneux, in the Ibarra debate, he kind of had this attitude that if I can just stack up enough quotes, enough evidences for my position, then doesn't it kind of seem like in the scales it'll like tip it over to making it maybe even true, right? So maybe you don't believe in papal supremacy a la Vatican I, but here's a whole stack of evidences and quotes, and therefore maybe this kind of, in this evidentialist way, kind of can edge it into being true. And I think that the mistake that all these people are making is having a very naive kind of empiricist, evidentialist view of paradigm level questions. And ultimately, this is a more fundamental paradigm level question. And so, as Kai said, stacking up evidences about secular scholarship believing that there is a preservation element going on with the early versions of the Quran has nothing to do with the topic of the debate. And it's missing the essence of the question, which is the fundamental issue was who's in continuity with what came before. And so stacking up evidences about the Quran as it's being preserved and stuff like that is never, ever going to get to proving the point of the debate. And that's why these people literally are sort of, they go haywire when you start asking them basic epistemic questions about the things that you start with as your epistemic principle. Whether it's sense data, whether it's self-evident truths in some classical foundationalist sense. If we go back to Azrar Rashid debate, he basically made the same type of argumentation. He said that, you just look at the world and you kind of bring in the sense data and then you form these basic principles on that, empirical basis. And all of this is old school, like not even addressing the level of questions that are being asked by people like myself and others. So I appreciate that, Kai. We'll go to Lewis now as Lewis does his slides. Let me pull over here to this page. Okay, go ahead, Lewis.
Yeah, before I share my screen, I just want to say I hope that what I'm about to present isn't just kind of repeating stuff already for the audience, but I made this presentation to kind of show the progression where Kai says that the Muslim apologist is really forced into this position of having to come up with basically secular argumentation for the veracity of their revelation, right? So hopefully for everyone in the audience, this will be helpful and hopefully not repeating things. So let me see if I can share. Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah. As long as everyone can see that, then it's fine. Okay. So I kind of wanted to present this as a sort of a role play because the traditional sort of dilemma is that the Quran confirms the Bible, and so either the Quran is false or, the Bible is preserved and contradicts the Quran, and so you have this sort of dilemma. But I wanted to kind of show how it's actually even a bit more complicated than that once you get different responses. So I wanted to take the perspective of this sort of role play where, as Jay was saying in the debate, you are a sort of a 7th century Jew or Christian, because that's kind of the bar. You have to prove this to that individual. So imagine you're a 7th century Jew or Christian. You're no one special, right? You're perhaps a goat herder who lives in Arabia. And this man starts to come up to you and claim that he's received revelation from God privately in a cave. He wants you to accept him as a new prophet from God, and he presents you the content of his revelation. You already have written revelation in the form of the Torah and the Gospel, but the prophet says things like, God revealed the Torah and the Gospel aforetime, and now brings you this new revelation as guidance. God told me that if I am in doubt about the new revelation, I am to ask you, i.e. the Christian, who read the previous revelation before me. You must judge by what God has revealed in the Torah and the Gospel. You have no ground to stand on unless you stand fast by the Torah and the Gospel, and you can find me mentioned in the Torah and the Gospel you have with you. These are all paraphrases of these various Quran verses. I've been faithful to the translation, so... but basically these are some of the verses Kai already mentioned, 1094, 7157. But the problem is that when you listen to this new revelation, imagine, it contradicts a lot of things in the Torah and the Gospel. So how do you respond? So there's a few different responses you could have. Will it go next slide? Yes. Oi mate, get stuffed, you wazzock. That could be a response you have. You could say, I accept you as a prophet.
Can you decode this this Brit speak for us? Like, as an American, I have no idea what getting stuffed as a wazzock actually is. It sounds
well, you know what? I'll
funny,
leave the mystery to you, Jay. I'll leave the mystery to you.
Okay. I'm just joking. Go ahead.
B, I accept you as a prophet uncritically. Tell me what to do next, smiley face. That could be one. Or you could say C, but the Torah and the Gospel conflict with your new revelation. You are a false prophet. And I think most people, if they put themselves in this position, even if you're an atheist or if you're a Muslim or if you're from any other religious background and you sort of imagine yourself in this position, I think you might pick C, right? You might pick C. So then the man says, well, you see, I have some explanations for why there's these contradictions. Let me convince you that I'm still a prophet, right? There's two options, really. There's only two options here. The first one is, well, what I mean is that, parts of the Torah and the Gospel are reliable. The other parts are corrupted. But the new revelation affirms the bits that are true, right? Okay. Then the second one is, the other option is, he could say, well, what I mean is that the entirety of the Torah and the Gospel you have with you are corrupted. The originals are lost. We don't have them. But the new revelation affirms those originals, not the ones you have. Okay. So what should you make of these responses as a goat herder? Maybe the man has a point after all. So the first one was that the Quran is showing parts of the Torah and the Gospel. Well, how do we know which parts? So you might say, as far as I'm aware, as a 7th century Jew or Christian, the scriptures are well preserved and reliable. Look, I'm just a simple man. I have my goats. I don't really. This is what's been taught to me, right? I don't have these perhaps super expensive manuscripts to be able to examine them myself. If some parts are corrupted, how am I supposed to know which are and which aren't, as an average person with no access to 21st century German critical analysis? So the man says, oh, well, you see, the true parts are the parts that agree with the new revelation I'm bringing, of course. And so then you might think, scratch your head. So I have to accept your new revelation uncritically, in other words, option B that we had before, in order to evaluate what I have had and relied on for the last 600 years. So curious. So that's a bit difficult, right? So here are also some absurd situations caused by this idea that you have this sort of parts corruption view, right? So this is a passage they love to quote, right? So, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. By the way, I've seen this quoted on Dyer stands in London. So that would be not corrupted, right? That would be the words of Jesus. Like, why would they quote him otherwise? So the green here is like good. The orange is questionable. And then the red is like totally like a traditional Muslim could not believe the red bits. So the idea that Jesus raises up on the last day, on Judgment Day, he resurrects the dead, right? Everyone sees the Son, right? The Son believes in him, have everlasting life, and he will raise them up on the last day. And then the whole bit about eating and drinking the flesh and blood of Christ, right? This is like totally. This would all have to be corrupted. So you have the text kind of switching between corrupted and not corrupted as you read through, as if we don't already have a whole, method.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we're a 7th century Jew or Christian, so it would be crazy to us. Even today, we have textual criticism. Like, we can know that this is totally false, right? But then is another one. This is just the other one I picked out. You could do this with a bunch of passages. But, and this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. This is another one they love to quote. But then look, see, like, glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you, as you have given him authority over all flesh. Right? Jesus has authority over all flesh, and that he will give eternal life to as many as you have given him. O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was. Right? So pre-existence of Jesus with God. So as you can see, you get this sort of swapping between corrupted and not corrupted, which is just sort of absurd. And by the way, it's weird because Daniel seems to sort of, it's not clear which view he has, but then I have these quotes from him from the debate where he seems to affirm this parts view, where he says, well, the 7th century Jew or Christian can see that Islam is consistent with the Old Testament, or with whatever text they had with them at the time. They would see that at the time because Muhammad was like Moses and his teachings were consistent with the teachings of Moses. And he says later, the teachings of Moses are found. We can look at Jews themselves in the 7th century. They're not looking at the Quran, they're looking at the Hebrew Bible. These are things that Daniel says in the debate. And I think this bit is the midway point of the debate. where I think he really concedes the debate, I'd say from this hour mark to about an hour 20 or so. So he seems to take this part's view, but then he goes back and forth on it. And this is the other view, the other point that they could have said, which was that the Quran is affirming these original lost texts that we don't have anymore. And what you have with you now is like totally corrupted, has nothing to do with the originals whatsoever. And so you might say, well, I'm confused now because you just said that you're mentioned in the books I have with me, and that I must judge by what is revealed in these books. And that if you are in doubt about what has been revealed to you, then you must ask us who read the books before you. How could this be referring to something we don't have with us and that is lost? So the text just ceases to make any sense when it says with you. They read about all these things, right? The Christians and the Jews. Besides, how should I know you are a prophet in the line of Abraham and Moses if the only reference I have had for the last 600 years is completely corrupted, right? This is a huge problem. How do you have continuity? Because you only have continuity if you sort of build up layers or bricks on top of a foundation. So like with the Old Testament, you have Adam and Eve, and it goes on Abraham, etc., 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 going on the prophets, Moses, and then the later prophets. But if that's all gone, then you have nothing with which to refer your continuity back to, which was the whole resolution of the debate in the first place. And so anyway, the man replies after you've said these things, he says, yeah, well, you know what? Forget about everything you've believed and known for the last 600 years, even though you need them to give context to the stories in my new revelation. Here are some unrelated reasons you should still accept me as a prophet. And I'd just like to mention this point is really key as well, is that it's not just that you have these passages in the Quran that affirm the Torah and the Gospel sort of directly like this, but also you have the Quran citing stories, name-dropping individuals from the Bible without additional context, with the assumption that the audience fill in the gaps, basically, right? So the Quran will say something like, remember the people of Lot and the calamity that befell them. So to this audience, to you, the audience is 6th century Jew or Christian. And then this man is saying, remember the people of Lot and the calamity that befell them. So like, who's Lot? Who are these people? What's this calamity, right? So this is all stuff that has to get filled in, all these details. Or like, recall Moses and the manna and stuff like that. And you need to fill in the gaps, right? And the only way you can fill in the gaps is with this prior knowledge you already have, right? So that's really important. And I'll list off a bunch of the stories that have these things, if you don't mind, if it's not too much of a bother. But here's some unrelated secular reasons you should still accept me as a prophet, right? And these were basically the only ones this is basically the position that, as Kai mentioned, the apologist gets sort of forced into. This is the process. This was the process from the start of the debate to the end. So here's these independent reasons, right? Preservation. Scholarship confirms Quran is preserved. Well, aside from the fact that preservation doesn't really have anything to do with true, I mean, we have textbooks that are completely well preserved, but you're a 7th century Jew or Christian, as Kai said, preservation is irrelevant, right? It's fresh. So this doesn't matter. Muhammad is like Moses. We can talk about that later. I mean, again, how do you know? Again, you need this continuity, right? You need this prior understanding of what Moses is like in order to understand, to make the connection, right? But if that doesn't exist, then you're just back to uncritically accepting the account of Moses in the Quran, right? So this reason ends up being circular itself.
Right.
And then you have the Torah and the Gospel have contradictions on matters such as polytheism and monotheism, as if that, even if that was true, it still wouldn't show that the Quran is a revelation or this man's new revelation is a revelation. So we can talk about that as well, by the way. I'd like to talk about that claim. But yeah, so that pretty much sums up that. But just to add the last bit, all these references to biblical stories that I've compiled so far from the Quran. This is like not complete. I still have more I want to add, but first of all, Abraham in Quran 22, the institution of mandatory pilgrimage, pilgrimages from Jews to Jerusalem, Passover, Shavuot, the booths, all this stuff is in there. With Aaron, the Quran always associates Aaron with Moses, but never has any info about him. Like, who is he? What's the significance of him? Why have two prophets minister to one community? Whereas in the Bible, you get this whole explanation of who he is. You have the rebellion of Korah in Quran 28. No explanation of what exactly Korah was doing. You know, you have this reference of him being described as having wealth because of his knowledge. You know, what knowledge? I'm realizing actually this is going to take really long, but you have again Zechariah in Quran 3, who takes, you know, the mother of God into the sanctuary, like Mary into the sanctuary. What is a sanctuary? Who is Zechariah? You know, we have videos on Orthodox Shahada about certain of these things which just have references to bits and then no additional context filled in. But the assumption is that the audience fills in the context, right? Like, you wouldn't name drop people, locations, events, you know, like that,
exactly,
unless your audience had knowledge prior, right?
Like,
So
basically,
anyway,
you're saying that, like, like just at a superficial reading of the Quran, Christians are better informed as to what the Quran is actually trying to refer to than the Muslims do.
Yes.
Like, you just name drop somebody, we already have this information. What is the Quran trying to say? Muslims have to speculate on it, and they have to go to their tafsirs and trying to gain some knowledge. But if I can just kind of backtrack a little bit.
Before you do, I'd like to comment here real briefly, just that there's another important element that wasn't really touched on in the debate, which I think is another angle by which Islam is shown to be incorrect, and that's the notion that revelation as a public thing ended with the death of the last apostle. And that's important to Christian theology because it's one of the easy ways by which we cut off cults. For example, when I've had discussions or debates in regard to Mormonism, when Mormon topics come up, Mormonism presupposes that there's an ongoing, continual, public, prophetic revelation that's in continuity with what the apostles taught, right? Essentially the same type of authoritative revelation of the gospel, equal to what the apostolic tradition taught. However, if you read Zechariah 13, which is a short passage, I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to refer to it. It's a mysterious passage about a time when, in the Messianic era, there won't be any more prophecies in the sense of public divine revelations, or in the sense of the kind of predictive thing that you see with Isaiah, Daniel, and so forth. There's this marked difference. It says when the Messiah and the Messianic era comes, we won't need this prophetic office, this predictive office anymore, because the era of the kingdom will have the finality of divine revelation. The word will have been spoken, as Hebrews says in Hebrews 1, in these last days he has spoken to us through his son. Spoken. There's not a new speaking that's continuing to go on. And that's why when we read Jude in verse 3, it says that the faith was once for all delivered to the saints. So remember, a Jew or Christian listening at the time of 7th century claims of Muhammad already has a deposit. Now, for the Jew, obviously, it's not the same as the Christian. But for the Christian, as an example, we already have not just a deposit of the faith, but the presupposition that public divine revelation is not ongoing. That alone, if a person was knowledgeable in their Christian faith, would immediately cancel out the claim, the presupposition of Islam, that there is a new prophet that has arisen to resurrect and save the corrupt tradition, or whatever the idea is here. So this alone, again, shows the finality of divine revelation, shows that this is a false religion and a cult. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Yeah. No, absolutely, Jay. I just wanted to backtrack there to what Lewis was saying to reinforce one of the points. And I think Muslims don't really appreciate the line of argumentation when they look at Surah 10, verse 94. This is a very important verse that really kind of locks them into this position. that we're arguing that they have to take. So, as Lewis pointed out, in Surah 10, verse 94, it's basically saying to Muhammad, if you're in doubt of the revelation, go and speak to the people who have been reading the scriptures prior to you. Now, the context here is that apparently Muhammad is completely unaware of prior revelation or the details of prior revelation. And you start from Surah 10, verses like 71 onwards, and it's giving you a narrative of prior biblical figures and some narratives involving them. And then it culminates with 1094, where Muhammad is instructed to go and talk to, for example, the Jews, and they're going to confirm for you these stories. And that's the whole point here, is that the Quran is saying is that, look, you'll know that you're a prophet because you didn't know any of these stories before. You're given it as revelation. You go and talk to this community, and they're going to confirm it for you. And therefore, you're going to have assurance that you are a prophet. So now you've got two things here at play. First of all, it is not a logical step to say that just because you are given information that you are now a prophet, because you have to keep in mind, Satan has been around since the dawn of mankind. He knows our history. He knows all these events. He knows exactly what is in scripture. So there is nothing preventing Satan from giving Muhammad revelation of what the Jews and Christians are reading. He knows the books. He says, here you go. This is what they're reading. Then go back and check with them. Oh, convince yourself that you're a prophet. So that is a form of satanic deceit. So for Muslims, it doesn't matter that just because the revelations match that you automatically have a prophet. So that's the first thing. But now the second thing is, and this is talking directly to Lewis's point, is, okay, so Muhammad gets partial information of these biblical figures and stories. So he goes to the Jews, but the Jews have these longer narratives in scripture that, okay, they will match up with the events, they will in general, and they will match up with the particular figures. Muhammad's going to see this. But then what is Muhammad going to do with the information that the Jews then feed him that he didn't get in the revelation? Is he going to say, okay, Jews, okay, you affirmed what I have, but everything else, we have to put a question mark there until I get further revelation from God that is going to confirm whether the rest of what you have is true or false? Like, you don't get that distinguishing characteristic in the Quran. It's just saying is, here you got revelation, go and talk to the Jews. And the Jews, they're going to confirm for you what you have, but in the process, you're going to get additional information that you probably weren't aware of. What do you do with that? And so you are forced from this to just basically accept it, that this is valid scripture, that you are going to a valid source to confirm your teachings, not just to confirm only those little bits that you've received, but that indeed those Jews, those Christians, they do have a valid revelation in between their hands that you are now following in line in that prophetic tradition. And that's the whole point, is to demonstrate that Muhammad is in line with this prophetic tradition. That's the whole point of him going to the Christians, going to the Jews. It's not going there to impose something absent of the tradition. And I think that's the whole point that Muslims miss when they read 1094.
I would add to that, just kind of backing up what I was saying earlier, that fits with what you're saying, that the idea of the prophetic tradition, Jesus says John was the last of the prophets. There's no more office of an Old Testament prophet. Now, the New Testament, when it describes apostles, prophets, and so forth, there are people in the book of Acts who engage in a kind of predictive sermons and predictive allegories and speaking and stuff like that. But even that's still not the identical office of a role of an Old Testament prophet, which was primarily to preach the coming of the Messiah. And as we pointed out in the debate, and as Lewis has pointed out in many talks and discussions, Kai as well, in Islam, you don't really have any clear idea of what a Messiah is, because a Messiah only makes sense in the context of the anointed one in the Hebrew prophetic tradition. That's why Jesus says that John was the greatest and the last of the prophets, because now he says in Luke 16, the kingdom of God has come, the kingdom is preached, and people are pressing into it. So the presence of Christ himself is the presence of the kingdom. The kingdom is to be in his presence, to be in ultimately the church, which is identical to the kingdom. So again, stressing that there is no new prophet. The very idea of a new prophetic continuity is just as false here as it is in the case of Mormonism. And just like with Mormonism, we might find things that were similar between Joseph Smith and Moses, but this or that trait of similarity does not prove that Joseph Smith is a new Moses, nor does it prove that Muhammad is a new Moses, because there's some bit of similarity here or there.
Yeah, I wanted to actually touch on that because he tries to he tries to draw these sort of loose continuities between Islam and the Old Testament, and and this is where the lack of knowledge really, I think, like happens, because he says, well, we have like imams who lead prayers, and we have like the sacrifice of the, like, you know, is it a lamb for Eid? I forget now. You can tell me correct me if I'm wrong, Kai, but then he's like, oh yeah, well that's you see, we have continuity, and it's like, when you tried to tell him that it was about sort of like the meaning and the significance, you know, not just an outwardly kind of veneer, he was like, well, who decides what the meaning and the significance is? Well, it's the church, right? And so now you're circular because you have to, and it's like, well, no. Like, the thing is that even sort of Jews, even sort of modern Jews and us wouldn't have a disagreement about sort of like fundamental meanings and significance of the priesthood and the temple, right, Kai? Maybe you can add to that?
Yeah, I would
and
add.
Also, you can tell us about if an imam is really a priest as well. I mean,
yeah, it's like, yeah, you can find similarities between anything, but the question is, are they similarities that are fundamental and essential, right? I mean, look, Jay's a guy, Joseph Smith's a guy. They're both prophets because they're guys. I mean, it's like you can find any kind of random trait that's a similarity, but the question is essential traits that show and demonstrate continuity. That was the whole point of what we were getting at here with this, with the debate, not just any old trait or similarity.
Yeah, so maybe I can clarify what I mean is, like, Jews and Christians wouldn't have a disagreement about there being a class of, like, an office of priesthood that exists as a mediation between man and God, primarily through the function of propitiatory sacrifice and the forgiveness of sins via a sacrificial system. That is not what an imam is. Like, not even close.
Exactly.
Look, it's really simple, Lewis. It's really simple. Jesus prostrated in prayer, therefore he's Muslim.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Okay, that's essentially what the argument boils down.
Exactly.
You have this superficial resemblance, therefore Muslim.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, you can't, like, I want to be respectful.
Kai, you're a guy. You're a guy named Kai. You're a Kai guy.
Yeah.
Jim Jones, a guy. You and Jim Jones are part of the same cult, the same religion. You're part of the People's Temple, Temple cult.
But it's very interesting just to even, like, we see the absurdity of that whole argument about Jesus being a Muslim because he prostrated. Guys, go to an Orthodox church. You're going to see that we still practice prostrations. Okay? We prostrate. We're not Muslims. So stop with that stupid argument. But that is literally what Daniel was basically trying to say with the imam. And I'm sorry, no. It means that you don't understand the office of priesthood if you're trying to make that argument. It's speaking more to a lack of knowledge and familiarity with how a priesthood functions, and not just a priest or somebody who is a leader. It speaks to a higher truth in terms of he doesn't grasp sacramentology, because the priest is distinguished from the laity through that office in terms of what he can do sacramentally and what the whole relevance is of the sacraments and how they relate to certain practices in the Old Testament.
We're so low tier with this level of stuff. It reminds me of the picture that Sneeko shared, where he said something like, Buddhists have prayer, Muslim have prayer, therefore Buddhist and Muslim have same God, right? I mean, somebody in the chat said Hindus prostrate, therefore Hindus Muslim. I mean, this is just so absurd, but go ahead.
And it speaks also, like, it just demonstrates the degree of unfamiliarity that Muslims have with our tradition and the way we understand certain things. And you even look at their commentaries on the Quran, and they're trying to understand the Christian communities and what we believe. And I started posting about this on the community post, and I'm going to do a little bit more of a more thorough presentation, but I'm just kind of throwing out some nuggets here. And Christianity really has stumped the early Muslim community, even up to the present day, but especially in the early community. It was so absurd that it's like you have specific errors or so-called errors that the Quran attributes to Christians. And they identify, oh, Christians make this error, and this error. They identify, let's say, that there are these 3 errors. And then they come into contact with Christian groups, and they see, oh, you have Melkites, you have these Jacobites, and you have these Nestorians. Oh, we have 3 groups. Wow. So 3 different groups, 3 different errors in the Quran. So we got to line up which group professes which error. Like, it's that level of unfamiliarity that Muslims have had with Christianity, that the polemics against us, it's just like, a lot of the times we're just baffled. It's like, where's this argument even coming from? Because it's clearly not within our tradition. It's not what we believe in. It's not what you're like.
I was just reading Ibn Taymiyyah, one of Ibn Taymiyyah's texts, and he makes the same mistake of equating Christianity with the Nestorian position, the modalist position, the Arian position, and some other made-up position that, where Mary's a goddess or a member of the Trinity. I mean, it's like way off, like not even close to what
it's not way off. And so then Muslims, when those who do take the time to familiarize themselves to some degree with our tradition, they realize there are serious problems. And so then they have to switch gears and say, well, no, the Quran, really what it's doing is it's talking rhetorically. So it's not talking that the Trinity is Allah, Isa, and Maryam. It's just basically saying rhetorically, don't commit polytheism. And it's like, no, when you go and look at your earliest tafsirs and even tafsirs of the 20th century, 19th century, it's very clear that Muslims did understand that by Trinity was meant Allah, Isa, and Maryam. And I've started posting about this, and I will be doing some more.
Ibn Taymiyyah thinks it means that.
Yeah. So this whole idea is that the narrative that's pushed by Muslims and maybe even non-Muslims alike, who may just not be familiar with all the tafsirs, when you look at Islamic scholarship, it's very clear they think that the Trinity that Christians believe in consists of Allah, Isa, and Maryam. And so we're not even in the right ballpark. And I know the whole Coloridian cope and everything doesn't work. It doesn't work. But I'd like to switch gears, if that's okay, if there's anything else that we wanted to touch up on before I go.
Sure, go ahead. Whatever.
So when I opened, I said that I was going to circle back to talk about why Daniel can't even make a preservation argument. And so this is a little bit peripheral now to the whole epistemic issue, but it's really just kind of to knock the ball out of the park, to just kind of show why he's got even no arguments. The arguments he wants to make aren't actually even valid arguments. So you ask the question, how do you define preservation? If preservation is meant letter for letter textual integrity of the Quran, then Muslims have serious problems. Daniel, during the debate, brought up the scholar Marijn van Putten as a non-Muslim scholar supposedly supporting preservation. Now, you didn't rebut him on this point, Jay, and that's fair because nobody was really expecting you to be familiar with this level of detail. So it's fine. But
yeah, I wasn't familiar with this.
Yeah, I am familiar with Putin's work, and so I'll bring him up, and I'll flat out say that if Daniel was actually familiar with Putin's position on the matter, then he would know that he completely refutes him, right? But Daniel, he has a track record of just simply citing sources without actually understanding what those
I think
sources...
Tucker Carlson really pushed Putin on this topic. That was a dumb joke. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I like that joke. But yeah, I mean, as other debates that Daniel has engaged on with certain individuals, they've demonstrated that this guy has a track record of really just not understanding the sources that he's quoting.
Shocker, right?
Yeah. And so let's just kind of really kind of emphasize this point. So if we consider, for example, what Putin said during his interview with Derek on Myth Vision podcast, and I know you recently had an exchange with Derek, and so Derek, he's not favorable to any side here because given his persuasion towards being, I think, irreligious, he doesn't have a stake in the matter from a Christian or a Muslim perspective on it. So Putin does an interview with Derek on his podcast. And this is what Putin says. He says, can we know whether the text as we have it in the Uthmanic text is exactly identical to how the prophet said it or had it revealed? We just can't know. From a historical perspective, we just can't prove that. Okay? So there you go. The scholar that you brought up, he's basically telling you we can't prove what was the Quran that Muhammad himself recited. But he goes on even more. He writes on Twitter and he says this. He says, there are all kinds of things you can say about the transmission and history of the Quranic text, and even sometimes with high probability. But it is not possible to have certainty that how the Quran we have today is syllable by syllable exactly how the prophet said it once. Okay? So when Putin is saying this, and you're going to say, oh, he's my scholar that's going to support me that the Quran is preserved, you clearly do not understand what he's saying. You clearly do not understand what his position is. Further, but does this consensus among 10 famous readers necessarily mean that it is exactly as the prophet said it? No. There are plenty of cases in history where people agree on something that evidently did not happen. It requires faith to be certain. Okay? So the fact of the matter is, Muslims cannot provide any kind of evidence to substantiate the claim that the Quran has been preserved as it was uttered from the lips of Muhammad. If anything, evidence favors lack of textual integrity. Not only that, Islamic scholars cannot even agree on what comprises the Quran. For example, take the ruling with regards to stoning, namely that adulterers are to be stoned to death. You cannot find anywhere in the Quran the punishment of stoning, but it exists as a ruling in Islam. And this problem has been well recognized by Islamic scholars. Okay, for example, I have a book here, Usul al-Tafsir. Okay, I don't know if you can see it there. And this is a book written by Muslims for Muslims, teaching the fundamentals of how to exegete the Quran. Muslims identify specific manners in which Quranic abrogation occurs. They say abrogation of both the Quranic verse and the law, abrogation
Can
of...
you explain what abrogation is real quick
So
for
abrogation
the
is
audience? Yeah.
when something is repealed. It's when something is revealed by a law and then is repealed. And so when you have abrogation of both the Quranic verse and the law, it means that at one point that particular verse comprised the Quran and it would be recited as the Quran, and you have to show it reverence as the Quran. And by reverence is meant like you cannot recite the Quran if you're in a state of ritual impurity, for example. So you have to show it that kind of reverence. And so having it abrogated from both the verse and the law means it's no longer part of the Quran. You no longer have to show it reverence, and it no longer has any kind of effectual ruling. Then you have abrogation of just the Quranic verse, but not the law. And this is where the stoning verse comes in. And so, or the stoning ruling. So at one point, the verse about stoning was explicitly part of the Quran and recited as the Quran, but then was abrogated or was revoked so that you no longer recite it, but the law still persists. And then you have an abrogation of just the law, but not the Quranic verse. So at some point, something was the law and you recite it as part of the Quran, but now you no longer take it as a law. It's no longer in effect, but it's still part of the Quran and it's still recited as part of the Quran, and you still have to show it. You have to still kind of revere the text when you do recite it. And this Muslim textbook, it gives stoning adulterers as an example of abrogation of the Quranic verse, but not the law. So don't play this hadith game of it being daif or something like that. No, your own books recognize that this is a valid example of a verse that no longer appears in the written Quran, but the law is still in effect. But now, to drive the point home, I'm going to flesh this exact example out with Imam Nawawi's commentary on an actual hadith with regards to stoning that we find in Sahih Muslim. Okay, and this is going to lead into my next point that demonstrates that Muslims don't even know what comprises the Quran. So this is what Imam Nawawi says, and this is very interesting. So it says, in this hadith, Umar says that the Quranic revelations included the verse mentioning the stoning. We recited, understood, and appreciated it. He is referring to the verse saying, if a married man or woman commit adultery, stone them totally. This belongs to the category of abrogated text, but the ruling remains applicable. There are cases where the ruling is abrogated, but the text is retained, and other cases where both ruling and text are abrogated. When a text is abrogated, it no longer has the status of the Quran and the rules attached to the Quran, such as its prohibition to be recited by a person who is in a state of ceremonial impurity. The fact that the Prophet's companions did not write down this verse serves as clear evidence that what is abrogated is not written in any copy in the Quran. Moreover, that Umar declared the applicability of the stoning as he was sitting on the platform with the Prophet's companions and other people attending without any of them expressing disagreement is clear evidence that the stoning punishment is confirmed. Okay? And so then there's just a little bit there, just kind of goes off on a tangent, but then he goes, Umar said, I fear that as a long time goes by, someone may say, we do not see any mention of stoning in God's book. They would thus abandon a duty stated by God. What Umar feared actually took place, as Al-Khawarij and others denied the stoning, as we explained earlier. Umar's statement indicates his insight and status, right? So here you have not even a clear understanding what actually constitutes the Quran. You have historical examples that record that, well, okay, we don't find this text in the Quran, therefore it is not part of the Quran. And if you look at, for example, like a Quranist only position, I'm not saying Daniel is a Quranist only, or even these progressives or whatever they are who want to look at just what the Quran itself says, well, you're going to lose this aspect of stoning being the law. And so now you've got a serious problem with regards to your preservation narrative. Okay? So where in the Quran is the verse concerning stoning? Okay? So saying it has been textually abrogated is a cope. And everyone sees that. And moreover, there are tons of abrogated rulings whose verses are still in the Quran. So now explain the logic why a divinely revealed book meant as guidance for all mankind removes a verse meant to provide guidance but leaves intact the ruling, yet leaves other verses intact but abrogates the rulings. Like, what is the logic in that? The Quran confuses people more than it guides them. And then there are other hadiths that talk about surahs being of a certain length that are no longer the case, and other hadiths that like a goat ate a manuscript, and for that reason those portions of the Quran are lost, and so on. No one except Muslims believes
the goat ate my homework. The goat ate Muhammad's homework.
Exactly. No, seriously, there's a hadith that basically says it's like, we don't have this portion of the surah because it was written down in a manuscript that Aisha's goat ate it, or something stupid like that. And so that part of the Quran is now supposedly lost. But remember, guys, the Arabs at the time, they were just fantastic memorizers. They memorized everything. But we're missing part of the Quran because the manuscript itself was eaten by a goat. Okay. No one except Muslim believes that the Quran, as it would have been uttered by Muhammad, has been preserved in letter for letter textual form. Okay. Nobody takes textual preservation seriously. Now, even if the Uthmanic text has been preserved, and I'm not claiming it is, I'm just granting the position for the sake of argumentation, Muslims cannot prove that the Uthmanic text is the original Quran. We can say, well, look, the Uthmanic text is actually a corruption. Okay, you corrupted the original Quran. Uthman burned all of the original Qurans.
Kai, do you mind if we give a bit more detail to that, the whole Uthman canonization event, and how he went with the codex of not one of the four people that Muhammad said should be the reciters of the Quran.
Real quick, hold on, real quick. Let me just read a couple super chats, and then we'll go back to Kai and Lewis on the abrogation stuff here. SLID since $5. Pimp Master J, very smooth. Exactly. See, people are figuring out what's up. Rigovich, $5. In regard to the libertarian guy from the other night, you do not smell bad. Wow, what the heck happened to Austin Peterson? Yeah, exactly, right. I was calling him Austin Lee Peterson because that's amazing. That's amazing. J Poopy, $10. Would you? And this is also relevant to what we mentioned earlier in today's discussion. How would you respond to a charismatic who claimed that the priesthood of Melchizedek ended with Christ, and that any man filled with the Holy Spirit can therefore teach? Well, you'll notice that in the New Testament, the citation of Psalm 110 about the priesthood of Melchizedek is applied in general to the entire church. There is a priesthood of all believers, but there's also still an authoritative hierarchical ministerial priesthood. So the idea that the priesthood of Melchizedek levelized the church and that there's no longer a ministerial priesthood is just completely false when you look at the arguments for apostolic succession. So J. Poopy, I would say, go look at the apostolic succession argumentation, and you'll see that the priesthood of Melchizedek is primarily in the priesthood of the Melchizedek, which is the Orthodox priest who offers the sacrifice at the altar in terms of the Eucharist. This is what Paul mentions in Hebrews 13. We have an altar from which those who serve at the tabernacle have no right to eat. So the idea that there's no more a teaching authority is false. Even again in the book of Hebrews, as Paul says in Hebrews, no man takes this authority upon himself. So it's not whether everybody in the church has the Spirit, it's whether everybody in the church has normative authority to speak. And Jesus says, he who hears you hears me, speaking to the ones that are sent. Apostles are the ones that are sent. Not everybody is sent, and not everybody is called to that office. Go ahead, back to you guys.
Okay. Yes, I do want to circle back to what you just talked about, Lewis, but let's hold off on that for a moment because it'll fit in better when I bring up the specific case of Ibn Masud. It's going to tie in better with Ibn Masud there. So there's a little bit more that I wanted to finish off saying with regards to this idea of letter by letter preservation. And so you have this Uthmanic text, okay, but all of these problems that we have with the preservation narrative, we still haven't even touched on the so-called 7 ahruf, okay, which Muslim scholars themselves admit they don't know what they are or what they mean. And no, the 7 ahruf are not just different dialects, okay? That's just the superficial answer that sheikhs give to Muslims just so that they don't cause any further doubts. They just dismiss it and say, no, the 7 ahruf, they're just different dialects. No, they're not just different dialects. Those who actually study the Islamic sources on the topic will quickly realize that saying the 7 ahruf are just different dialects is a lie Muslim scholars tell the gullible Muslim masses so as to not create doubts in the preservation narrative. In reality, Muslim scholars do not even know what the ahruf refer to. And this is problematic with the claim that the Quran has been preserved in the sense of textual integrity as Muhammad would have recited it. Okay, so Muslims may know or speculate the function of the ahruf, but they don't know what the ahruf actually are. And Imam Nawawi states on the authority of Baqillani that the 7 ahruf were preserved in the Uthmanic manuscript. Yet Tahawi says that over time, only one harf was retained. So do Muslims have all 7 ahruf or just one harf? Is the original Uthmanic text preserved or was it lost? And Muslims boast about how well they have memorized and preserved the Quran as a community through oral transmission. Okay, well, then it's reasonable to expect the 7 ahruf to have been preserved by the Muslim community irrespective of manuscript texts. So where are the 7 ahruf? If Muslims cannot preserve something as integral as the ahruf or even knowledge about what the ahruf are beyond just vague statements and conjecture, then why believe the claim that they were able to preserve the Quran perfectly? The ahruf are integral to the Quran, yet Muslims talk about them using vague statements and conjectures. So now we get into Muslims get themselves into two dilemmas. The first dilemma, if you claim that the Quran is perfectly preserved, then it means you know the 7 ahruf. However, since you are not certain what an ahruf even is, and admit that you might not have preserved all the ahruf, then you cannot justify the claim that the Quran is perfectly preserved. The second dilemma is if preservation of a single harf means that the Quran is perfectly preserved, i.e., it is not necessary to have all 7 ahruf in order to claim perfect preservation, then it is the meaning of the revelation that must be used as the determiner for the claim of perfect preservation. In that case, Muslims cannot accuse Christians of having corrupt scripture if manuscript variations do not alter the underlying meaning. This then forces Muslims to take preservation to be that of meaning and not textual integrity, which just compounds problems for Muslims even more. So we can just go into dialogue now. I'm going to circle back to the problems that we have with preservation of meaning, but I don't want to monologue too much here. So if you guys want to chime in.
Yeah, those are great points. Lewis, go ahead. You had something you want to say.
No, I was just going to say that, well, Kai will circle back and give more detail to this, but in short, sort of Muhammad had four, and you can correct me on this, by the way, he had four main sort of master reciters for the Quran that he established, and he was very clear about, if you want to learn the Quran, you have to learn it from these four people.
Yeah.
And then when Uthman, like Kai's been talking about this Uthmanic codex, when Uthman took over after Muhammad's death, then there was sort of dispute over how the Quran was being recited amongst various different people in the region. And in the end, basically, Kai mentioned the manuscript burning. So Uthman sort of standardized a single Quran codex and burnt all the other manuscripts. And the codex that he used, that he ended up canonizing, was not one that was by any of the four master reciters, right? So I think as Christians we are in a sort of a privileged position with respect, like we have a bit of freedom with this whole preservation issue, because I tend to take the view that I guess the Uthmanic Quran is generally well preserved. You know, I suppose we don't really know if it was exactly what Muhammad said, which is a problem for Muslims, but not a problem for us, you know. And I just tend to see the Quran as just another piece of interesting sort of wackadoo literature from the, you know, Middle East at that time. Yeah, but to be fair, it's quite interesting, and I'd like to do a stream with Kai on the sort of filling in the details I mentioned earlier of these stories in the Quran that sort of seem a bit odd, but once you add some ancient Near Eastern context or some Christian or biblical Jewish tradition context, it actually makes a lot more sense. And so the Quran can be read in that way by us. You can just sort of read the Quran through an ancient Near Eastern / Christian / like Jewish context, and it's quite an interesting piece of literature. But that's really it. I mean, or you could have, you know, a very harsh critical view of it, or, you know, whatever you want. Whereas the Muslim really is just kind of forced into this position of having this view on our scriptures that they're either partially corrupted or they're completely corrupted, and you just have to have this conspiracy theory, right? Like you I mean, it's always funny when they talk about not having the originals or whatever, but I mean, even modern textual criticism, even though, like, let's say, for example, the Gospel of John, even though modern textual criticism might doubt who the author is or say it's anonymous or whatever, the fact of the matter is that they still believe that what we have today as John, aside from variants, you know, is pretty much what the original was written, what was in the original written down by whoever the author is, according to them, right? So, and this whole view, like I showed earlier in my presentation, of this sort of like, this bit's completely corrupted and this bit's fine, and then as soon as we get to this line, well, that's corrupted. This is just like, it's wacko. Like, it's not what the modern textual criticism would even say. And even though Daniel keeps invoking it, it's his position is really completely at odds with it. And there was this moment in the debate where you were kind of talking past each other, because you'd make the point that, well, these higher critical scholars, they wouldn't obviously they don't think the, you know, Christian Bible is legit, but neither do they think the Quran is. And Daniel was like nodding, like, yes they do. And what he means is that basically it was well preserved from the time of Muhammad, And he's got points about radiocarbon dating. Maybe we can talk about the Birmingham manuscripts or whatever. But he takes this view. But what you're saying is that these scholars don't really see the Quran as being having veracity to it in terms of history,
it's not a divine revelation from a supernatural source.
It's not a divine revelation, and even from a higher critical point of view, it's not. So even Bar Ehrman, I think Apostate Prophet had Bar Ehrman on, who, if you don't know who he is, for the audience, he's very big name New Testament scholar who's like critical of the New Testament. So he's, he wrote books about the textual preservation of the New Testament and all this stuff, and Muslims really love to cite this guy. But when he was asked, like, what kind of information do you think the Quran gives us about the history of Jesus, he just says, well, nothing. It's not of any use to historians to understand anything about Jesus. It's just way too late. And it's written in a completely different region. It's completely useless. And they really also think that this sort of like hadith tradition is this really kind of rigorous, amazing sort of like, science, right? But you can go watch an interview between a sort of leading scholar in the matter of hadiths, and
I'm going to bring him up. Don't spoil it. I'm going to bring him up.
Well, I'd like to. I've got the link to the interview and I can post it. But basically, I mean, do you want me to say it, or I don't mind. Like you can bring it up. But.
Yeah, I mean, I have it within my presentation the way I want to structure it. And it gels nicely. But just I'll make the point.
Basically, in short, the higher critical project, to some degree may confirm that the text of the Quran is a quite well preserved historical document. But there are lots of well preserved historical documents, right? And maybe the Quran is, even if the Quran maybe it is quite well preserved, on the sliding scale above others, it really doesn't really mean anything if it's not actually giving you an account of true history. Like I said, if it's just recounting these a hodgepodge of apocryphal stories. For example, there's the I wouldn't say it's apocryphal, but it does have apocryphal stories about, say, Jesus speaking from the crib and stuff like that. But kind of one of the ones that I think Kai wanted me to talk about was the 7 sleepers of Ephesus story. So in the Quran, if you don't know, if you're a Christian, there's a story of 7 who basically became Christian saints, passion bearers. Were they martyrs, I suppose? No, they weren't even martyrs, but they suffered for the faith in a sense, but they were under the persecution of an emperor, like a real historical emperor. And the story goes that they basically went off into a cave to escape the persecution and slept in a cave for 2-3 centuries until Christian emperor Theodosius, had made Christianity legal. And then they came out of the cave all well, and everyone sort of, marveled at this. And then they passed away a time later when their sort of coming out of the cave was supposed to be taken as a sign of restoring faith in the last day of judgment and the resurrection and this kind of thing. And the Quran has this exact story, right? It takes these it kind of ums and ahs about the number of people it was, but it has the exact story, and it takes those individuals, those youths, as being true believers, right? As being like, I suppose Muslims, right? But they're actually Christians. But it gets sort of details off. Well, not off, but it misses out details, I suppose. And the Christian tradition, which predates it, fills in those details for you. But these stories are recounted again with the assumption that the audience listening knows what they're talking about. So it's really quite interesting. But I'll pass it on to
Well, one thing about that is, in the debate when I brought up the 9 or 10 examples of incoherencies and inconsistencies that Gabriel Said Reynolds mentions in his book, and he brings up the 7 sleepers of Ephesus text, Daniel just dismissed that as, well, he's not a believing, he's an atheist, unbelieving academic, and he doesn't. And it's like, yeah, but you just cited unbelieving academics as if they prove the preservation of the Quran text argumentation, so in other words, it's a selective ad hoc usage of the unbelieving scholarship when he wants it, right? And it doesn't even really prove the topic of the debate, right? The debate wasn't can you find secular scholars who admit that the Quran is a preserved text. The debate was whether there's continuity between the Old Testament and either the New Testament or the Islamic tradition. So none of these things, and that ad hoc element is also what Lewis was just referring to in regard to large portions of the Bible, because the Quran, and when it mentions people in passing, when it refers to events in the Old Testament, David, the Ark, stories in Genesis, it assumes that the listener, the hearer, has this pre-existing Jewish and Christian context and history behind it. But then what happens is that when it goes to explain why the Quran is the final true revelation, it ad hoc will literally cut out gigantic portions of the text that it has just referenced. And there's no clear epistemic principle as to when and why that is. It's only when it conforms to the Quran. But that was the thing that was in question, and that's why Daniel's whole argument failed.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to go back to a few things that Lewis had said before I continue. I think we're making a really good point, like in terms of what the debate proper, where Daniel failed. I still want to kind of hammer the point home with regards to this preservation, because I mean, it is something that he brought up, and I just want to keep hammering it, why preservation itself can't be used, but it's also relevant for the larger scale apologetics against Islam, because they do hold to this whole preservation idea. And I want to just kind of put that out there, these talking points with regards to why we seriously have problems with the whole preservation narrative in its entirety. Now, just what Lewis had said, and I think this bears worth saying, is that this whole idea there's like a manuscript variant in John or something like that, or wherever it may be. Muslims when they approach manuscripts within the Christian tradition, in a mindset that they're treating our manuscripts as if they are on par with the manner in which, for them, the Quran was revealed. Like, for them, the Quran is the speech of Allah. It is a direct revelation from Allah. It is something that is on the preserved tablet, word for word, letter for letter, in whatever way you want to understand it. You can't impose that on Christian manuscripts. Like, we don't have that same view of our scripture that Muslims have of the Quran. For us, variants do not cause us any problems. For us, the variants are just different ways of expressing the same fundamental truth. Christ is the truth. Okay. Christ, the truth of the resurrection. Like, you don't need to have it word for word to say that Christ resurrected. You can translate that into any language, into any manuscript, however you want to phrase it. The general idea is what you're communicating. And as long as that is preserved, that is fine for us. We don't have to have a word by word preservation narrative that Muslims necessitate by their standards. So that was the one thing that I wanted to say. The other thing was with regards to Ephesus, the sleepers of Ephesus. So what the Quran doesn't understand here is exactly the historical context of those seven sleepers, who the emperors were. Emperor Theodosius, they didn't understand the Christian communities alive at the time. They didn't understand what the Christological debates were. So essentially, what the Quran is advocating for is that you have these seven sleepers who are Christians, who are historical proof of the ability for God to resurrect. Resurrect them to what? Further prove that the Christianity at the time is true? Okay, great. Thanks. You've just granted us our position. Why would God provide a miracle of these Christians resurrecting to strengthen the Christian community alive at the time, which is Orthodox? which is exactly the type of Christianity that the Quran actually doesn't even address. Like, it doesn't even criticize the Orthodox Christianity that existed at the time of Muhammad's lifetime. So I think that just bears saying there. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that before I go on to other things. All right, so I'm going to continue on. And so with regards to the whole preservation issue, so I established how there's this problem of this textual integrity understanding of preservation that is leading Muslims to have to admit that when they invoke some kind of preservation argument, that they really have to, they're cornered into having to look at preservation by meaning, not just a simple like letter for letter. And when we look at the entire corpus of hadiths, and this is important for hadiths because they are what explain to you basically how to practice Islam. So without the hadiths, you don't really have a viable Islam. And so the thousands upon
Just
thousands.
real brief for the audience, can you remind people what hadiths are in contrast to the text of the Quran itself?
Okay, so basically hadiths are they record the actions and sayings of Muhammad that are apart from the Quran. They're basically like a living testament of how to put the Quran into practice. And so they basically inform Muslims on the life of Muhammad apart from what is narrated in the Quran, and the things that Muhammad would do and say that are actionable to derive Islamic law. Like an example would be in the Quran, it tells Muslims that they have to pray, but it doesn't give you all the details of how to actually do the prayer. But you find that in the hadiths, because it says, oh, Muhammad would do this and this, he would say this and this, he would bow, he would prostrate, he would. So it gives you all the details of how to actually pray that you don't find in the Quran itself. So when we look at the thousands upon thousands of hadiths in Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood, so on, do you know how many hadiths in all of that entire corpus are considered what's known as mutawatir bilafs, or mass transmitted according to exact wording, letter for letter? Not more than 10. Go pick up any standard book on Usul al-Hadith, and you will find that this kind of hadith, there aren't more than 10 of them. Okay? So that means that basically the entirety of the hadith corpus is transmitted according to meaning. It's preserved according to meaning. In other words, hadiths, which give you all the details how to practice Islam and that constitute one of the primary sources of Islamic law, rely on preservation according to meaning, or ma'ana. Now, the point here is that if we take the position that preservation can only encompass letter for letter transmission or textual integrity, as Daniel needs to do in order to attempt a critique at Christianity, then Muslims have a very, very, very serious problem with hadiths, because then that narrow understanding of preservation excludes hadiths. At that point, the Muslim position quite literally reduces to being a Quranist or Quran only. To get out of this absurdity, Daniel, along with all Muslims making his stupid argument, have to recognize preservation to also encompass transmission in meaning and not just textual integrity. And this then naturally leads to asking questions like, well, who transmitted these meanings? How do we know? And so on. And when you start asking these questions with regards to the hadiths, then you come to find out that hadiths are wholly unreliable. The whole idea of checking isnads or chains of transmission and grading hadiths as sahih or daif is absurdly unreliable.
Hold on. So you're saying not one jot nor titty will fail until all of the hadiths are fulfilled. Is that what you're saying? Now hold on, Kai, but wait a minute. Are you saying that the fart hadiths are not inspired real tradition or what?
So
I'm serious
okay.
though. I'm joking, but I'm not joking.
Okay.
Like there are fart hadiths that, you know, like
Yes.
Satan's keeping you from praying because of farting
Right.
or something. That's just
right. So these hadiths, they're just simply like the ridiculous hadiths. These are just supposedly things that Muhammad did, and because he did them, Muslims should do them or should emulate them. And if you don't have these hadiths, you can't uphold Surah 33 verse 21, which says in Muhammad is to be found the best example for mankind. So the Quran is telling you that if you want to live as a perfect Muslim or live the life as a Muslim that Allah intends you to live, you have to look to Muhammad. And that encompasses every aspect of his life. With which hand to eat.
Right. Hold on though, but people are asking like, no, there actually are what two hadiths about farts. I'm being serious.
Yeah,
possibly.
possibly.
My favorite.
No, there's two.
They're
They're funny because like Sam Shamoon brought them up last time.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of stupid hadiths.
No, but these are
yeah.
not the ones that you can doubt if you're like a strict Sunni. Like you have to believe these. And I'm bringing this up because it's relevant to what you're saying about the absurdity of certain hadiths that are not that are strong is what I'm trying to say. They're strong hadiths about Satan causing farts that keep you from praying and going to mosque or whatever.
Right. Yeah. There are a lot of like if you go according to the Sunnis' own methodology. So we're not looking at like critical scholarship examining this up. It's like if you use the criteria of the Muslims themselves who have graded these hadiths and they themselves consider them authentic, then yes, you do get these kinds of absurdities. And for them, it's like when they look at this, when they set their parameters, they're like, well, these hadiths, they obey the parameters that we've set, so we have to accept them. They're not, the contents are not contradicting the Quran. So as long as the contents themselves do not contradict the Quran, but they satisfy all of this other criteria, as stupid as the contents are, they have to accept it as authentic.
Right. And
so you have and you have things of like Satan, like I think like urinating in your ear,
that's one of
farting,
them, right,
and stuff like that. I mean, at some point, the stupidity is just so so blatant that like you just lose track of this. Like
the only reason I brought that up is because when I was talking about not one jot or titty failing from the hadiths, I was making a joke, but they're actually the people in the chat are asking, wait, are there actual hadiths that deal with Satan inducing farts and stuff? And I'm thinking, and absolutely there are. There's at least two, and we covered it with Sam Shamoon. So I'm not trying to derail the conversation. I'm making a point.
Right, exactly. No, that's fine. Yeah, that absolutely. But this is the thing here is that when a hadith is established by the Muslims' own criteria as sahih, in principle, like that hadith cannot be rejected. So Muslims lock themselves in, like they later generations will come into trying to question whether or not a hadith that was previously graded as sahih or authentic really is. And so then they'll say, well, no, upon scrutiny, these guys actually got it wrong. We're going to tell you now that this is actually a weak hadith because they overlooked something, stuff like that. I was going to bring up that point in a minute, and I'll encapsulate it in the way that I want.
real quick, the reason I'm laughing,
Yeah.
it's not you, Kai. There's some really funny comments in the chat. Somebody said we should Muslims should pull a Ben Shapiro and say that farts don't care about your feelings. So
Yeah.
you can say farts don't care, facts don't care about your feelings, farts don't care about your feelings. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So just basically the point here is like no one apart from Muslims take hadith methodology seriously. And this is where I'm going to bring up that scholar that Lewis wanted to talk about to bring up. I'm going to bring him up. He's non-Muslim. He is a hadith scholar. His name's Dr. Joshua Little. And he basically says that academia takes the position that you, and this is the default position, that you have to assume a hadith is unreliable until proven otherwise. And so then proving a hadith is reliable is an uphill battle likely to end in failure. And when he's talking about unreliable, he's not talking about according to the standards of Muslims. He's talking about when you do a critical examination independent of the Muslims' own standards for evaluating this stuff, but just looking at it from a historical perspective, from a critical perspective, there's just so many problems with hadith methodology that you just have to basically take the position that this is an unreliable piece of text, because when he's basically saying is that when you critically examine these hadiths time and time again, you just prove them to be fallacious and idiotic, and you just cannot treat them as being reliable. He uses the analogy of turning a dial of more problems or less problems when it comes to hadiths, that basically he says like all the dials are turned to max for the various problems you can possibly encounter with hadiths. And well, bless you, Jay. Of course, Muslims like Daniel will dismiss scholars like Dr. Joshua Little, because what he says is quite devastating to the preservation argument that the Muslim position relies on. And this next point that I want to make, it's going to get lost on a lot of Muslims watching this. The surface level argument uses Islam's own self-proclaimed authentic sources to demonstrate that the Muslim position is inconsistent, while the deeper level argument demonstrates via the Muslims' own responses to problematic hadiths how flawed hadith methodology really is. And so then this puts into question the Muslim claim of being able to preserve something. Okay, so ultimately this is circling back to this ability to preserve something. Daniel's claim that the Islamic Ummah is able to preserve something. That's where we're circling back to it. I don't care so much about the hadiths themselves, what they're saying. I'm talking about how these hadiths are viewed upon from a preservation aspect. And it's when you analyze them, it negates Daniel's claim of the Ummah being able to preserve something. You have to ask yourself, why would Bukhari and Muslim and other hadith compilers exert the effort to preserve as authentic something they knew to be inauthentic? They wouldn't, because they didn't consider what they were preserving to be inauthentic. Bukhari and Muslim believed that every single hadith that they preserved was truly authentic. This means that they didn't have the capability to distinguish between something that really was authentic versus something that in factuality is inauthentic, as later scholars would come to argue. So then what exactly is being preserved? Is the idea to just preserve everything and relegate to later generations to sort out the details? You have to keep in mind that authentic hadiths are used to formulate binding rulings in Islamic law. So are people going to use inauthentic hadiths, thinking they are authentic, to formulate legal rulings of hundreds of years before someone comes along and says hadith such and such isn't actually reliable? That's an absolutely absurd position, yet it is essentially the position of modern day Muslims. And this is the position that Daniel cannot adequately address. So not only were Muslims historically not able to ascertain with absolute certainty the authenticity of what it was they were preserving, but Islam as a living faith reflects that which was quote unquote preserved. And if living Islam reflects false hadiths, then you don't have the religion of the quote unquote prophets, right? We don't have to go through every single hadith, because the overarching argument is getting at the fundamental point of epistemology. By its very nature, the hadith system cannot guarantee you that Islam has been preserved. In a nutshell, uncertainty is inherently built into hadith methodology. And this is not something that Muslims can overcome. Uncertainty is inherently built into hadith methodology, meaning that Muslims cannot claim with 100% certainty to have preserved Islam, let alone the religion of prior prophets. So I'm going to end that part there if you guys want to chime in.
Francis 379, Islam at every angle fails to deliver a good reason on why the crucifixion is even mentioned in the Quran. It is hard to take Islam seriously. Thank you for that, Francis. Cataclysm, $15. I no longer have to annoy Kai to do a debate review. I'm glad that we're doing it. Hopefully the Jake debate review will be good as well. Great stream always. As always, I can't talk today. Thank you, Cataclysm. Yeah, thank you guys for those super chats. Remember that I do share the super chats with guests, and so you're also supporting Orthodox Shahada. My guests today are Lewis and Kai from Orthodox Shahada. You see them linked in the title of today's YouTube stream, so be sure and follow those guys as well. Rachel Wilson sends $5. Andrew and I were received into the Orthodox Church over the weekend. Glory to God. Hey, that's great. Many years to you guys. So glad to hear that you finally were able to be received. Thank you for the role that you helped in the role that you played in helping us find the true faith. Prayers for your protection and blessing. Thank you so much, Rachel. Lewis, did you want to comment on Kai's discussion there of the hadiths?
No, he said pretty much everything, but I didn't remember if he mentioned you can actually go watch the interview between Javad Hashmi and Joshua Little, the scholar. And he basically gives like 20 reasons why the hadith are totally unreliable. And he sort of goes in and from least problematic to most problematic, but he had 20 of them. And I can actually post the link. I'll post the link in the Zoom and then you can share it. There you go. Okay, I'll put it in that. There you go. But the last thing I wanted to kind of mention was just this sort of like this third point of independent reason why like a Christian would accept the new revelation was that he said that there was contradictions between the New Testament and the Old Testament, and that the Old Testament has contradictions within itself. And his primary examples are, you've got like this polytheism over here in the Old Testament, and then you've got monotheism over here in the Old Testament, and well, these two aren't compatible, so that's a contradiction. And it's just really strange, because then his critique, even though he said it was an internal critique of your position, ceases to be an internal critique. It becomes an external one. He's now arguing, well, he's arguing something that you don't believe. Like, he's saying that there's contradictions in the Old Testament. And then he also had this weird view where he was like, oh, like, well, but you're circular as well, because you use the New Testament to refer to the Old Testament for continuity. And it's like, And he was like, "Oh, you cherry pick the bits you like and the bits you don't." And it's like, no, like that's
No,
not
we
our
don't
view.
cherry
Like
pick the
our
bits we
view,
like. Exactly. That's
no,
a
we
totally
take the
different.
whole Old Testament, and
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
take the whole Old Testament, and we think it's all preserved. We don't have this arbitrary like parts are corrupted and parts aren't. But I think what he's saying is that we like don't we like don't pick the bits that talk about monotheism. But
Yeah.
the whole point of the church fathers going through this sort of arduous process of, defining the doctrine of the Trinity was because, as he said, there's parts in the Old Testament that seem like quote unquote polytheism. It's really, like you said, distinctions in divinity, the two powers in heaven and that kind of thing. And then you also have affirmations of monotheism over here. And so
Right.
the attitude of the church fathers was like, well, we have to make sense of the revelation here. And so the doctrine of the Trinity arose as a consequence of analyzing these seemingly conflicting parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So no, like the whole point was a harmonization.
Which,
Actually, the New
which, by
Testament.
the way, and I'm not disagreeing with you, Lewis, but just to make this point that the harmonization was not like church fathers reflecting on an apparent contradiction in the Old Testament. The harmonization is reflecting on Jesus's harmonization in the gospel text, and particularly throughout the Gospel of John. I mean, the Gospel of John is so important to the Trinitarian dispute that when the church fathers look at the Gospel of John, they're looking at the Son of God, the way that he is harmonizing these passages throughout the Old Testament. That's really the locus of where we derive the doctrine of the Trinity, not from Plato and how do the Cappadocians use Plato. That's not the essence of where we get the doctrine of the Trinity.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, this is very clear. Like, if you read Saint Athanasius and you read the history of the Council of Nicaea, it was actually the not anti-Nicene in the sense the ones who were against the Nicene definition, the Arians, who were the ones that were invoking philosophy, right? That were invoking,
Absolutely.
I mean, philosophy in the sense of the sort of strict views of
Yes.
Greek philosophy, but it was actually Athanasius who was insisting on the biblical texts and the scriptures, right? And being the primary source
Exactly.
of understanding the nature of God and all that stuff. So it's ironic. It's really ironic, to be honest, the whole situation.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. That's another great point. A lot of the textual scholarship and theological scholarship around that time actually makes that point too. John Behr makes that point. The Rada-Galwitz thesis makes this point that it's actually the Arians and then the Eunomians that kept referring to metaphysical dogmas that would bind the church fathers and the Nicenes such that they couldn't argue for real distinctions in a triad, and they keep appealing to these really ultimately what are kind of Neoplatonic ideas at the time. Absolutely.
But yeah, so the ultimate point for me to Daniel is like, no, like these aren't in tension. Like it's just the Trinity, right? It's like, but they don't want to go there. They don't want to accept that. So because they just can't. They're absolutely forbidden from doing so. So it's just really it's rather unfortunate, really. But anyway.
Yeah, I want to stress that the reason I'm bringing it back to some of these kind of basics is that a lot of people in the audience might not be familiar with a lot of the standard Islamic argumentation, but they will typically, argue, oh, the Trinity is this pagan corruption. It's invented by Paul. It's invented by Nicaea, which, by the way, those things are mutually exclusive. If it's invented by Paul, it can't be invented by Nicaea. So, the deity of Christ, the Trinity, these are doctrines that are based in the Old Testament. That's why it's so important to go back to the Torah and to the prophets and to the wisdom text to prove this, because that really undercuts the whole presupposition of the Islamic apologetic. Kai, did you want to pick back up?
Yeah, I'm going to pick back up. This is the last part that I want to hammer home with the whole stupidity of the preservation narrative from Muslims. And this example is, I think, a very powerful example. It's the one of Ibn Masud. And we can circle back after this, Lewis, if you want, to then discuss the whole Uthmanic burning and the Uthmanic
Can we,
text.
before we do that, actually, since
Sure.
you're going to do another exposition, which absolutely fine with, I'm not at all critiquing you. I do need to.
Sure.
We need to take a brief break here, and
Okay.
we're gonna do a message from the sponsor. This will be a 3-minute break. If anybody needs to run and grab a water, use the restroom,
Sure.
now would be a perfect time to do that. I want to remind you guys that our sponsor is Chalk.com. You can head on over to our link there in the show description, chalk.com. This is their promo. I'm also going to go grab a water, so I'll be right back.
I'm going to put you on something crazy real quick.
Yeah, so
Most of
basically,
these
like
Zoomer
3
gym
minutes.
bros are consuming macro-guzzling synthetic dyes and synthetic sweeteners on the daily. They don't even know it. Goofy AF. There's nothing great about that. Do not listen any further unless you are an alpha or sigma male. This is important and there could be consequences. There's a new certified sigma male pre-workout powder for sigmas only. It is guaranteed to empower you to dominate your co-workers, fire your boss, aggressively gamble, or invade a small village. Chad Mode stands out from the crowd by excluding artificial flavors, preservatives, sweeteners, and dyes. We've even avoided so-called natural flavors, which are actually not natural at all, ensuring a clean and effective formula. Experience the pure goodness of Chad Mode, colored with organic blue spirulina extract, organic lemon, cherry, and organic maple crystals. Forget synthetic caffeine made in a sketchy Chinese lab. Embrace the natural power of organic green coffee bean extract, which will get your mind going and pump you up to the max. Chad Mode is made in America with all clean ingredients, the first clean pre-workout of its kind. Why are these people adding synthetic sweeteners to every single pre-workout when there are many studied downsides to consuming nasty fake sucralose? Each dose of Chad Mode contains the kick of a cup and a half of coffee, delivering a surge of energy alongside essential vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and herbal extracts. Chad Mode will allow you to fire your boss and dominate anyone who opposes you. Chad Mode will make you more dominant in your daily life, so proceed with caution. It's as simple as mixing 1 or 2 scoops of our fine powder into water or juice, providing you with a delicious, energizing beverage featuring a burst of sweet organic fruit flavor. Chad Mode will give you the extra edge you desperately crave. Don't miss out. Secure your supply of Chad Mode on TikTok Shop with a limited time massive discount. Elevate your workouts and supercharge your days. Chad Mode, not for your average gym bro zoomer who consumes synthetic blue dyes on the daily. Buy on the TikTok Shop now with a massive discount provided by TikTok for a very limited time. Buy now while this is still available, or go to chalk.com and use code in caption. Chad Mode has been flying off the shelves because it's the first of its kind, certified for alpha males only. Do not buy if you are a beta. We will refund your money. I'm gonna put you on something crazy real quick. Most of these Zoomer gym bros are consuming macro-guzzling synthetic dyes and synthetic sweet.
Be sure and use that promo code J50. Head on over to chalk.com. Remember, you can also get the Tonkat Ali. If you head over to Chalk, you'll see on the front page the stack that they have for male performance, and that is definitely something I recommend. We've been in the gym quite a bit in the last few months, Jamie and I both, and we've really enjoyed both the Tonkat Ali and the Chad Mode. That's some hype stuff right there. It even has the meme, dude, as you can see. So head on over to chalk.com. Again, J50. You can also use the promo code J53Life. That's J53LIFE. And that will give you 53% off all recurring subscriptions. And we're going to pick back up with Lewis and Kai as we were getting into the next stage of the critique of, it was hadiths. Are we still on that topic?
No, we're done with the
Okay.
hadiths. This is my last. superficially they think, yeah.
You're referring to Daniel's claim of what was it? Could you repeat that? It was muted just for a second. Go ahead. You're
Oh,
fine.
sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So he relied, in order to try and address this apparent critique against textual integrity, that, oh, you see these variances in the tradition, in the Islamic tradition. He tries to explain it away using what's known as qira'at. And that's just basically the manners of reciting the Quran, that they're not really corruptions. They're just different ways how you can pronounce the Quran when you're reciting it. And oftentimes the Muslims, they will give a very simple example that you find in Surah Al-Fatiha, the very first surah, and they'll say an example is to say Maliki versus Maliki, so like ownership versus king of the Day of Judgment. Maliki Yawmiddin, Maliki Yawmiddin. So it's like, well, which one is it? Well, you can use either one, because Allah is the king of the Day of Judgment, but he's also like the owner of the Day of Judgment, because the king owns everything in the kingdom. So it's like, okay, yeah, different ways of saying things, but you're more or less basically saying the same thing, and you're just kind of accommodating the language to be kind of more robust. And that supposedly is something like to make the Quran more beautiful, or as an example of its kind of like miraculous nature. And so that's the typical example that Muslims will use, and that's the line of argumentation that Daniel was relying on by bringing up qira'at to basically rebut the objection to textual integrity. The problem that Daniel has with appealing to the qira'at as an argument for preservation is that he's not able to account for traditions like Ibn Masud. Now, why is Ibn Masud important? In Reliance of the Traveler, it says this. It says, the consensus of scholars is that the companions of the Prophet were at various levels of knowledge in religion. Not all of them were capable of giving formal legal opinions, nor was the religion taken from all of them. Rather, there were those of them capable of legal opinion and ijtihad, and these were a small minority in relation to the rest. And there were those of them who sought legal opinion and followed others therein, and these were the vast majority of them. Most of the companions' legal opinions came from only 7 of them: Umar, Ali, Ibn Masud, Ibn Umar, Ibn Abbas, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Aisha. And this was from thousands of the companions. End quote. That's from Reliance of the Traveler. So Ibn Masud is an absolute heavyweight in Islamic law, being one of 7 mujtahids universally recognized among the Sahaba, being an authority on the Quran. Now, you cannot have such a stature without knowing the Quran. He accepted Islam very early on, well before Muhammad's hijrah, and was a personal servant to Muhammad. His Quran version, which he kept despite Uthman's standardization, which was widely known, embraced, and used in Kufa, and by that I mean Ibn Masud's copy was widely known and used in Kufa, on the whole was significantly different to the Uthmanic text, containing copious amounts of variants. And these variants, you cannot explain them away using qira'at. Muslim sources minimize and remain silent or just outright deny the well-known serious discrepancies that existed between Ibn Masud's copy of the Quran and Uthman's, as well as the historical conflict between Ibn Masud and Uthman personally. But now, as an example of a difference in Ibn Masud's copy of the Quran that Daniel cannot explain away by invoking the Qira'at, is found right in the first surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha. There are actually several variants, but I'll just give one as an example. So while Muslims like to give Maliki versus Maliki in that first surah, in all the 10 accepted ways of reciting the Quran, the first surah is to be recited Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim. But Ibn Masud recited Irshidna Sirat al-Mustaqim. This is a textual variation that cannot be explained by appealing to Qira'at, because none of the accepted Qira'at has this variant. This is a perfect example to demonstrate that the Quran has not been preserved, if by preservation you mean letter for letter transmission. If you want to claim Quranic preservation is letter for letter, then Ibn Masud completely refutes you. And the only way you can get out of the problem is to accept that preservation has to encompass preservation in meaning. But if you do this, then the argument against Christianity falls apart, because now you open the door to recognizing the church as a legitimate means of preservation, because it is the church that preserves the meaning of the textual tradition. And any variance within the text can be reconciled using the preserved meaning entrusted to the church body. So I wanted to end there. Yeah. So that's the crux of my preservation stuff. If Lewis, you wanted to circle back to the whole Uthmanic burning.
No, I think I've already spoken about that enough.
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I'll just add to it. Basically, I think what you can say is that, okay, well, let's now turn the tables on the Muslims and say, well, look, here we have proof from Ibn Masud that your Uthmanic text is corrupted. Okay, we have evidence here to show you that what you call the Quran is corrupt. So you want to say that the Injil is corrupt? You want to say that the Torah is corrupt? Well, here you go. The Uthmanic text is corrupt. So now, how do we know what the original Quran contained? Did it contain more explicit references to Christianity that maybe Muslims didn't like, and Uthman burned away those references that would, let's say, vindicate our position? Well, you guys can't prove what exactly was the Quran that Muhammad recited. We are showing you that the Uthmanic tradition is actually a corruption. It doesn't matter if you can demonstrate that from the Uthmanic manuscript onwards you have preservation. You have that problem between Uthman and Muhammad, and that's the problem. That's the time frame that's problematic for you, because within that time frame you can definitely have elements in the Quran that you no longer have preserved, because we've demonstrated right now your inability to preserve, that there are corruptions.
And you'd never know.
And you would never know. And the whole idea with the hadith methodology, that's like, nobody takes that serious. So your hadiths, they don't inform us of anything with regards to the Quran. It's just nonsense. And when we go to your tafsirs and we look at how your own tradition talks about the Quran and Christianity and Judaism, like, it's just laughable that you guys have like no idea. And I think, did you bring it up during, I can't remember if it was during the debate. I think you did, the whole idea of the Ark of the Covenant as if it's like this box just flying around.
I think it did come up, in passing,
Yeah, and I mean, I did a series of videos on specifically the Ark of the Covenant and just demonstrating that the Quran has no idea what the Ark of the Covenant's purpose is, what it was, all the nuances surrounding it. But what if, for example, I make the claim that says, well, hold on a second, there actually were references in the pre-Uthmanic Quran that were more explicit, that actually didn't have this nonsense of the way Muslims understand the Ark of the Covenant, that was closer to the Christian and Jewish traditions, that would be a little bit more closer in line to that prophetic tradition, that Muslims then realized, oh, this is actually going to be very problematic for us. We have to eliminate that. I'm just going to throw that out there. I mean, what's wrong with my corruption narrative? Because right now, you're giving me the ammunition from your own history to level a corruption claim against you. It's not to say that maybe that this is actually what happened, but nevertheless, you can't disprove my claim, but I am in a position to make that critique against you.
All right, so we got a few super chats we need to hit here. I am the Boogeyman 250. The idea of a neutral historiography where you just look at the facts has long since been discredited in the history of philosophy. Yeah, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. It relates to the idea of neutrality and evidentialism and classical foundationalism, and that's just another element of it where, well, you just neutrally look at the facts. I think pretty much every Islamic treatment of epistemology that I've come across operates in that very naive approach. The mainstream position actually admits that we can no longer account for objective historical truth within a secular framework. Yeah, and that's why there's no such thing as neutrality or the idea that reality isn't theory laden. I am the Boogeyman 250. History must be interpreted not only by the person reading it, but also those that write it down, which requires epistemology, metaphysics, ethics. This is what Tag hits at with the issue of God, correct? Appealing to non-believing historians to ground your religion also makes no sense. I mean, it really has a little, I mean, you could use it as a rhetorical device, or you might use it as a way to back up a point. But again, like, the preservation of the Quran has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. In regard to what we were debating about continuity with the Old Testament. I mean, the texts of the Vedas are believed to be very well preserved, and everybody agrees that the Vedas teach polytheism. So, I mean, does that prove polytheism because it's been preserved? No. Chili Time, $1. I was wrong about the angel Jabril. Do you think it was Satan? I'm just wondering. Do you think Muhammad is a false prophet? Yes. Whether he was really encountering an angel, I mean, no, I don't think it was an angel, obviously. I think it was either he was an epileptic or he was possessed. I mean, Sam Shamoon pointed out one of the hadiths relating the story of him falling over and having seizures, and so this sounds like a person who has, spiritual problems or mental problems. Ray Gino, $10. Allah does not have any children. How can Jesus be a Muslim if he's praying to the Father? The religion is Antichrist. So I want to ask you guys, would you like to address who do you think the angel Gabriel was? And if Allah doesn't have children, then how can Jesus pray to the Father?
Well, about the about the how can Jesus pray to the Father? Well, that's why I had those slides where you have Jesus referring to himself as the Son and referring to God as his Father. And I had the bits that are Father in red and Son in red, because the Quran absolutely negates any sense of sonhood or sonship to anyone. Call it, like, if you asked a Sunni Muslim to call God Father and they were even moderately religious, they can't do it. Like, they're not allowed to do it. As to the angel Gabriel, I don't know. Could have been an evil spirit. Could have been false historiography. I don't know.
Kai, are you familiar with this?
That's why I said, like, Christians have a certain amount of freedom with this whole issue. Like, you can, whatever you're convinced of, right?
Kai, are you familiar with this issue with, is it one of the hadith that speaks of Muhammad sort of falling over and having seizures and,
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, that he would convulse, like fall down and convulse, that is very well documented in the hadith literature, that is basically when he receives revelation. The idea of the angel, so the point here is the backstory, the way the Muslims describe this, it's that Muhammad goes to the Jews and says, hey, I'm receiving revelation. And the Jews are testing him. They say, well, who's the angel who's giving you this revelation? Give us the name, if you will. And that's how Jibril comes into the picture. Is he hears these stories, he hears about an angel visitation upon Maryam or Mary, with Christ being conceived in her womb, and he's like, oh, then this must be the angel of revelation, because he spoke to Mary. There's an angel that communicates to Mary. And so this is the angel that communicates the divine will to humanity. And so then that's how they get this understanding that this is an angel, Gabriel, that is then in the angel of revelation. Now, obviously, I believe that there is like a demonic influence on Muhammad. I don't think there is any angel that we recognize as an angelic being that is communicating to Muhammad. I do believe it was demonic. There are certain things that are very demonic in nature that would make me sway more into the demonic than a mental illness. For example, in his biography, when he first receives revelation in the cave, he's like, he wants to throw himself off of a cliff, because he thinks like he's going crazy, he's going insane, when the revelations stop, and he's like wants to commit suicide. And well, Muslims will say, well, no, that was actually a dream. Like Muhammad dreamt that. He didn't actually want to commit suicide. So I think that could be a cope of theirs. But even then, even if it is a dream, that you would think to want to commit suicide, or that the thought of committing suicide would come to your mind, that's demonic. That's not a mental illness. That is demonic. And it's like, well, how do prophets in the past, how did they know there were prophets? There has to be some kind of self-realization, or there has to be something in the communication.
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, I don't think anywhere in the biblical record or history of a Hebrew prophet, there's nothing like this where people are having these sort of epileptic episodes and acting irrational and insane and thinking that they're possessed. I mean, that doesn't happen when we have, the cases of people like Daniel. Daniel is humbled when Gabriel shows up, but it contrasts Gabriel's revelation to Daniel with what supposedly is Gabriel and Muhammad, and they're night and day.
Right. And the Quran also, like many times, makes reference to Muhammad about how the population that he's preaching to basically thinks he's possessed, thinks he's into witchcraft.
Exactly.
Right. So it's like the population like see that. Now they'll say that, well, okay, you do have prior prophets that were killed off by the native population, absolutely, but nevertheless, the fact that the population thought him bewitched just kind of supports the narrative alongside the hadiths themselves that are basically saying that Muhammad is experiencing things or experiencing thoughts that are in line with demonic possession.
Yeah, exactly. Now, guys, I want to remind you too to utilize the link for Lore Coffee. We have a great other sponsor, which is Orthodox Coffee Makers Lore Coffee. You see them behind me, and I put the link into the chat there. I have tasted multiple flavors. It is really good, high-quality coffee. And if you'd like to support Orthodox Coffee Makers for a supremely smooth, flavored organic roast, head on over to Lore Coffee. The link is in the show description. I also have linked Orthodox Shahada, our guests today, Lewis and Kai. Thank you guys so much for coming on. Really great points. Appreciate everything you've offered. Any closing statements? And we're doing this because the next debate is 1 week away. Over on Modern Day Debate, I'll be debating Jake on the question of Trinity and Tawheed. So we are sort of reminding ourselves of the Islamic argumentation here with combating the BFFs of Daniel and Jake. Anything you guys want to leave us with?
Well, I just want to say thanks, Jay, for having us. We're definitely thrilled to be on your show. We're very supportive of your work. I'm sure you'll do very well against Jake in your upcoming debate, because Jake has a lot of the same problems in understanding these issues that Daniel has. And in all honesty, once they came forward and like Daniel thanked Jake for helping him prepare for the debate, for me it was like, all right, well, thank you for saying the obvious. I mean, the level of argumentation is exactly what we expect from Jake. And so I don't think, if that's the way he prepped Daniel, I think he's going to be just walking into this debate having the same problems, lacking understanding epistemology and these kinds of questions. He's going to try to skirt around that. What I would say here is that the debate in this review, I hope, has really kind of demonstrated that the preservation argument or the preservation narrative that Muslims want to put forward, it does no work. It is an irrelevant argument. It gets you absolutely nowhere. It's not where the argumentation is. It's not going to prove the point that you want it to prove. And honestly, like Muslims, it's embarrassing the level of argumentation that you're bringing to us. It really is. You need to, if you want to have like an honest discussion of these issues in an intellectual way, you need to start learning epistemology, because time and again it keeps coming back. This is what you have problems with. You struggle to understand basic epistemology.
And not just that, fallacies as well. I mean, I asked Daniel multiple times if he knew what certain fallacies were, and he didn't even seem to be aware of basic informal fallacies.
Right. So the fallacies one kind of comes into it, but provided that they understand the fallacies, even if they can understand a bad argument, if they make a bad argument, they can see it's a bad argument, they don't necessarily know how to do epistemology. It's like, yes, you have a bad argument, but where do you go from that bad argument to make it into a good argument or to make it into a viable argument? And this is something like, you look at the Dawa scene, you look at Jake, you look at Daniel, none of these guys understand how epistemology works. And so I would say that is where you guys need to work on if you want to have some kind of viable criticism against us, against orthodoxy. And until we see that, you're not really bringing anything to the table.
Exactly. Lewis, anything you want to leave us with?
No, just echo what Kai said, and thank you for having us on. It's evening here, nighttime almost. And also, I'd just like to encourage the audience to do their own research, do their own reading into these topics. We've referred to a number of different scholars. Oh, another one that, yes, you mentioned Gabriel Reynolds, of course. This is actually a really good book, The Quran and its Biblical Subtext.
It was a good book, yeah.
About what we've already talked about. He's not atheist, by the way. He's a Catholic. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Props to you guys for recommending that book. That was a big addition to the debate. So thank you guys so much. All right. Reminder to everybody to head on over to Orthodox Shahada. Their channel is linked. Be sure to subscribe to them. They do a lot of great work. There's a lot of stuff in their archives as well, which I often share. I want to encourage you guys to go into their video archives on their channel and look up all those great classic apologetic works and videos that they've done. And yeah, that's about it. Everybody have a great Sunday, and I'll see you in the debate